the FLI's conference here at the conference hall of St. George's Cathedral. Today's conference is largely about understanding the truth in key areas. But as we all know, parents, teachers, it is not enough to know the truth, but we've got to be able to pass it on to the next generation too. That's why we're starting with homeschooling. We're all aware today of the scale of the challenge facing Catholic families, which is why homeschooling is so interesting and potentially so important. What is it? How does it work? Is it a practical and potentially successful option for more families? We're fortunate in having here today someone who knows homeschooling from the outside and from the inside. Antonia Robinson writes on homeschooling, and she is homeschooling her 4 children. The presentation is entitled Your Children's Primary Educators, Parents, or the State. Antonia.
It's a funny thing to be asked to talk about home educating, because it's a bit like being asked to talk about parenting. Every family is different, every child is different, and no 2 families go about it in the same way. And in many ways, home educating is simply an extension of parenting. Because of this, before the question session, I'd like to open the floor up to home educating parents at the end. If there's any home educating parents or children who are being home educated, or home ed alumni, who might have a different view from mine, who might have different experiences, and they can perhaps bring up anything I've missed. You've probably all got a mental image of what a home educating family looks like. Perhaps they're hippies, anarchists, Amish-style Puritans, children with unbrushed hair running wild, maybe socially inept children with helicopter parents hidden from view by overprotective families. None of these are really true. Home educators are simply normal families, like yours, who have chosen not to send their children to school. Some of them will only home educate for a year or 2, and they'll just enjoy more time with their young children. For many people, home educating starts as an extension of early years parenting, where parents question the point of sending tiny children into large group environments. Some families will home educate all the way through the primary school years, and their children will go into the school system at year 7. It's a fairly easy transition because secondary school is new to everyone. Others will go into school in time for GCSEs or A-levels, but equally, many home educators sit exams, particularly GCSEs and IGCSEs, as external candidates and gain exactly the same qualifications as they would do if they were at school. You might have noticed I'm using the word home educating, whereas actually in the introduction, homeschool and homeschooling was used. If you do a Google search, homeschooling will come up a lot. What's the difference? At a basic level, they're simply different names for the same thing, parents choosing to educate their children outside of a formal school environment. But if you take a closer look at the differences in approach between those who call themselves homeschoolers and those who call themselves home educators, you'll find a fundamental philosophical difference. In the United States, home education is usually called homeschooling, and with good reason. The norm there is for families to do school at home, replicating the school model, including curriculum, timetables, formal terms, even lunch breaks, and so forth. The hours spent at a desk might be very similar to those of school children. The main difference being is the children aren't in a state or formal school. In most states in America, home educating families actually register with their local education authority in their state as a home school. And the rules about what is required vary a lot from state to state, but the assumption in many states is that a school model will be followed. There are 2 million homeschooled children in America. 2 million. Just think about that number. It's a massive cultural phenomenon. It's a huge subculture. In Britain, there are at least 50,000 home-educated children, and possibly more. We don't have compulsory registration. We're not sure exactly how many of us there are. The school-at-home phenomenon is less common here, and home education is less subcultural. Home education has been a fairly respectable option for British families for hundreds of years. It's worth remembering that the so-called great public schools, the oldest, most academic of our secondary learning institutions, were created for those who could not afford to have their children educated by a tutor at home. Even back then, one-to-one education was considered the gold standard. Group learning was second best. St. Thomas More educated his daughters at a time when formal education for girls was considered a bit iffy, and obviously he did this at home. Even after the establishment of mass schooling, learning at home was seen as a positive option for many. Agatha Christie, Noel Coward, Beatrix Potter, Florence Nightingale and the Queen were all largely or entirely home educated. In Britain, home education does not belong to any particular social class, religious, economic, political or racial group. There's an enormous diversity of home educators and of approaches. I'm going to really briefly run through some basic approaches. It's a bit like talking about parenting approaches. There are almost as many as there are families. School at home is literally reproducing the school environment in the home. Families keep school hours, have break time, as we've discussed. In England, I actually know a couple of families whose children have worn school uniforms as well, so they've really gone for the whole school vibe. Learning is very structured. The disadvantages are that it loses the freedom that home education buys for children and families, which is one of the main benefits families find about home education. But many new home educators, particularly people who've removed children from school because they've had a bad experience or been unhappy, start off doing school at home because it feels safe. Most develop a more flexible routine over time, which allows them to enjoy the benefits of being in charge of their own time and doing things seasonally in a way that benefits their family. One of the most common approaches to home education here in Britain is semi-structured learning, where children will have some formal learning and use traditional educational materials, but also have time to do things that interest them, or simply more time to spend with friends and to enjoy the creativity that comes from boredom. Autonomous learning is where children's learning is entirely self-directed. They learn only what they're interested in when they're interested in it. If it's done properly, this isn't an abdication of parental responsibility, but I'm not sure it is done properly all the time. Parents will, for example, do something called strewing, which is leaving interesting books or objects or materials where children can access them and find them. And it's amazing how much more interesting things are when children discover them themselves than if you hand them a book and say, this is really interesting. Autonomous educating is based on 60s and 70s educational philosophies by writers such as John Holt, and there are extreme versions which involve full family democracy. There's one called Taking Children Seriously, which is a movement where any parental guidance is seen as coercive. It's not really compatible with Catholic teaching. Semi-autonomous learning, though, is quite often twinned with semi-structured learning. Many parents, including ourselves, take a semi-autonomous approach for part of their children's education, which means that it gives them loads of time to kind of delve into things that they're really, really interested in a way that gives more breadth than, say, a national curriculum would. There are various philosophical methods, some of which come from a Catholic perspective, like the Charlotte Mason, Montessori, and classical curriculum, which have excellent free resources online. I don't really have time to go into the philosophies individually, but if anyone is interested, I'm very happy to point you in the direction of resources. So basically, here in the UK, any approach is acceptable. We've got everything from complete autonomous learning through to school at home. And as you'll probably guess, the vast majority of people fall into the very wide middle. Our family uses a traditional academic approach to English, maths and science. We use a Charlotte Mason-inspired literature-based approach to round out our education in areas like geography, geology, philosophy, and so forth. We'll use a range of catechetical resources, including Faith and Life, and lots of other books, many of which are now out of print, but really sound. It's amazing what you can find on Amazon. And where possible, we'll combine subjects. So, for example, history, politics, art, RE, geography, and architecture can all be bundled together when you're looking at the Tudors. You can round things out by throwing in some literature and cookery. My advice is always to follow enthusiasms. If a child is extremely interested in one subject, it's usually pretty easy to delve much deeper than would be possible in school. My eldest is studying Latin and ancient Greek, and sitting formal exams in them, simply because he wanted to. It definitely was not at my behest. With young children, you don't even need more than a tenuous link to something they're interested in. For example, dinosaur maths works wonders with 6-year-old boys, where ordinary boring maths would elicit groans. But don't you need to be a teacher? That's the thing I'm asked more often than anything else. And the answer is no. To home educate, your relationship with your child and your enthusiasm are your most important teaching tools. An interesting fact is that although many teachers home educate, and in fact in one of our South London groups, we realised at one point that half the people there, half the home educators there, were teachers. And a lot of them were two-teacher families where one teacher was teaching in schools, the other was home educating the children, largely because they knew what was going on in the schools and they didn't want their own children there. So although many teachers home educate, many of them admit that they have to unlearn a lot of what they've been taught during their teacher training, because a huge amount of it, particularly at the primary level, is about crowd management and teaching to a large number of people, rather than one-to-one learning, which is essentially about a relationship. It's only actually in the last century that we've had this crazy idea that rather than knowing something about a subject in order to teach it, you have to be taught how to teach. Some of the most inspiring and successful home educators I've met over the years have had quite limited educations themselves, but they've been really open to learning alongside their children. A desire to learn, to share, to inspire, to nurture a sense of adventure, these are far more important than pedagogical training. It's true that later on, as subjects become more complex, some parents ask for help from tutors, and quite often they will share the cost with other parents, having tutorial groups where each parent will say, pay £5 towards having a tutor come in for an hour, or they'll swap areas of expertise with other parents. It doesn't have to be expensive to home educate. Your main expense will always be having one parent at home rather than at work. As a result, you'll find, as a rule, that home educators live in smaller houses in cheaper areas than they might otherwise. But in terms of learning, you can spend as much or as little as you like on home education. Certainly at the primary level, there are few expenses. Your costs will be travel to usually free museums, and if you pack a lunch, a day out in London can be had for the price of one adult bus fare, children travel free. Charity shops and second-hand bookshops are treasure troves to home educators. Home education groups are brilliantly cost-effective and actually really mess-effective as well. Art and crafty groups, I think glitter, glue, clay, paint, are a great way to save money on art supplies. But even better, the mess is made in a church hall or community centre, and there's a big group of parents to help clean up at the end. Libraries offer special cards to home educators if you need to borrow more than the 12 books they normally allow. Museums, galleries, historic buildings, English heritage, leisure centres all offer educational discounts and group rates for groups of home educators. And many places do free or inexpensive workshops for home educators as well. You just need to ask. And there's a great joy in going to these places when they're quiet. At home, learning happens sometimes when you least expect it. At other times, it happens because you spent hours and days and even weeks working on making that learning happen. There's a degree of fluidity to each day that school can't replicate, and learning becomes a family lifestyle rather than something boxed up between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. 5 days a week. Is it better than school? I don't know. It's simply different. There's no such thing as a normal home educating day. I tend to look at what we've accomplished over the course of a week rather than day by day, because one day might be a washout, the next might be end-to-end learning. Home education allows for all the ups and downs that life throws your way, whether that's to do with health, the weather, having a new baby in the house, or just ups and downs in learning. There's a great joy in being cuddled up on the sofa, reading to your children, and not having to trudge up the road to school on a freezing cold morning. Likewise, on glorious sunny days, we can indulge ourselves by spending long days outdoors with friends. Museums and galleries are our playground. Have you ever seen the Natural History Museum empty? We have, often. My children used to know some of the curators of London museums by first name. That's how often we were there. And it's amazing how much learning can be done in a hammock under a shady tree on a nice day. From an educational point of view, home education allows a parent to tailor learning to each child. With 4 children, I've really noticed how much their learning styles differ. My eldest was reading famous 5 books at the age of 4. My youngest has just turned 7 now, and he's still challenged by Biff and Chip. His handwriting's illegible. He's left-handed, it might have something to do with it. But he's got an incredibly sharp mind for mental maths, and he's great at telling jokes. They're all different. Learning happens in peaks and troughs. Many parents here will know that firsthand from having taught their children to read before they went to school. Children will gain ability, then they'll appear not to learn at all while their brain catches up. And just as you're about to give up on any further learning, they leap forward. From what I've seen, a lot of learning happens this way, whether it's reading or learning to crochet or science or maths. Sometimes the learning process is quick, and it's possible to keep pushing the knowledge in like stuffing a sausage. But it doesn't always happen that way, and sometimes we need to back off and just trust that learning is taking place. And I think this is one of the strengths of home education. A good example of this was my eldest daughter, who around the age of 9 developed a mental block about maths. As her ability had been good up to that point, I intuited, and I'm going to use some really technical language here, I intuited that her learning compartment was full. And so after a few tearful sessions where she said, I don't know why, I just can't do maths anymore, I said, fine, we won't do maths. We just won't do maths anymore. And I put away her book. And we didn't do maths. We did play with number bonds. We worked with Cuisinart rods. We used other math manipulatives, which can be used in lots of fun and creative ways without calling it maths. And we did lots of things like baking and shopping that involved mental math skills. 5 months later, she took the book back of her own accord without me knowing and came to me saying, Mummy, I finished that old maths book. It was really easy. We've not had a problem since. As a culture, we recognise that the gold standard in education is one-to-one, or one to a small group. This is the model at Oxford and Cambridge, a very, very high teacher-to-pupil ratio. One-to-one intensive tuition means that learning is considerably more efficient than in a traditional classroom setting with 30 children. This means that for young children, only a few hours a week of formal learning is needed, if any at all. And I say if any because canny home educators have long figured out that keeping lessons informal can often mean that a child will be able to read, tell the time, give correct change, draw beautifully without a single formal lesson. Beautiful drawing ability leads very easily to beautiful handwriting. The fine motor skills involved are identical, but it's way more fun to develop those skills by drawing than it is by writing letters over dotted lines. Children who learn to draw before they learn to write don't need any of the baby writing practice exercises. They simply learn to form letters and off they go. And I've seen children go from drawing to cursive handwriting. It's not difficult. My eldest son's starting his exams this year, and we've found moving from a free and easy home education routine to following the exam curriculum enlightening. There's a read, memorise and regurgitate GCSE regime which contrasts starkly with the interdisciplinary tapestry of our previous experience at home. Both are useful. The exams test basic knowledge. The home education projects inflame academic passions, broaden interests, and often provide a depth that a one-size-fits-all national curriculum doesn't allow. This was first pointed out to me by a Catholic science teacher friend who noted that my then 11-year-old had somehow acquired university-level knowledge about genetic inheritance and how to prove various hypotheses about phenotype, simply from keeping and breeding and researching the colour genetics of fancy mice, because he was interested. Likewise, one child decided to learn the charge of the Light Brigade by heart in 24 hours, and then perform it in a variety of styles, ranging from rap to Broadway, to a fair imitation of the recording of Tennyson reading it himself, and this got really wearing after a few weeks. There's only so many times you can hear a poem loudly declaimed to not go mad.
Half a league, half a league, half a league onward. All in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600.
With this spurred an interest in the Battle of Balaclava and a spin-off interest in 19th century military history and strategy. Earlier in the year, Chesterton's Lepanto had the same effect: memorization, background, history. And we all chuckled when a visiting school's child said, "Oh, I know that poem, you should study it." Study it. We'd had to live it for weeks. And that's what home education is good at. It's living learning. Children have got the time and inclination to dig deep into subjects that interest them and to follow that interest as far as they can. Parents have to do what they can to stay sane. So why might you want to home educate? Home education is a lifestyle choice. It's not simply a matter of where learning is located. It will affect your whole family. You can see this as a pro or as a con. You'll spend a lot more time with your children if you home educate than if you send them to school. That means more joy, but realistically it's also more sorrow, frustration, and definitely more mess. It's hard to keep a tidy house when you have small people actively learning. Your house will be full of stuff: books, paint, glue, microscopes, seedlings, weird stuff in petri dishes, mice. Even people lucky enough to have a separate learning area find that their children, the younger ones at least, will migrate back to the kitchen table for learning with mum. That's the nature of home education. It's a cosy kitchen table endeavour. And it was that human scale learning within the domestic church, within the family, that first attracted us to home education. Home education builds a strong family culture. Your home educated children won't spend all their time with you, but the family will be a much greater influence than it would be if your children were at school. And if you're like us and you've got a wide and varied circle of friends, your children will also have influences from families who may not share all your values. Children imitate what they see, consciously or unconsciously. And if they are in a rich, deeply Catholic culture every day, for a good part of that day, and have strong role models in their parents, they are to some extent inoculated against the ills of the world. I say inoculated, not 100% protected, because as any microbiologist knows, there is no foolproof vaccination against disease. Sin is the most pernicious disease of all. It's a disease that corrodes the soul, and it is the hardest to protect our children against. But protect them we must. All Catholic parents must do their best to create a Catholic culture that is more than in name only at home. All of us, no matter where our children are educated. But for those families who home educate, their daily prayers, morning prayer, the Angelus, the 3 o'clock prayer, blessing before meals, grace afterwards, as well as the nighttime prayers and rosary, and of course daily mass. These prayers punctuate their day and they strengthen faith within the family. One of the things that worries a lot of potential home educators is the reaction of their friends and family. But it's important to remember, if you do anything countercultural, anything at all, people will react to it. They'll react to it often in ways that suggest they think you're judging them, even if that's the furthest thing from your mind. If you're a Catholic family already living a genuinely Catholic life, you're already irredeemably countercultural, so it should be water off a duck's back. But do expect some silly questions. Don't you want him to go to university? He's 4. And some statements that are really wide of the mark. You know, he won't be able to get any exams unless you send him to school. He will, but he's 4, so let's revisit that in a decade. Generally, family and friends do come round to the idea of home educating, but it can take time. In fact, they often become incredibly supportive once they see that their wild fears aren't realised and your children are happy, healthy and thriving. A good tip for potential home educators is not to make any grandiose statements. Just say, we're home educating little Ignatius this year because we think it's the best thing for him. We'll see where we are next year and make a decision about what's best for him then. While we're talking about family and friends being supportive, or otherwise, I think it's worth mentioning parish priests. For Catholic families, the ability to attend daily mass and to create an authentically Catholic culture and education is a big draw when it comes to home educating. A parish priest supportive of home educating is an enormous blessing, and they are out there. You sometimes have to look for them, but across the board they tend to be very sound, orthodox, excellent priests. Why? For a priest to support home educating families means he supports the parents in their God-given role as first and primary educators. Significantly, it also means that he values the role of the parent over any political considerations about Catholic schools. Finally, it generally means that he's a realist about the ability of Catholic schools to sustain the next generation of Catholics in this country. How will they ever make friends? A common objection to home education is the socialisation argument. However will your children make friends if they're not at school? And how will they learn to behave in society at large? They'll be antisocial freaks. They'll have no social skills. All of those are things that have actually been said to me at various points, usually by people who should know better. First, home-educated children are rarely at home. It's a bit of a misnomer, home education. Particularly when young, for the large part, they're out and about in the real world. They get to know their local shopkeepers, librarians, swimming pool attendants, park keeper, parish priest, and post office workers in a way that schools children rarely do. They interact with adults and other children of various ages all day, and this can often make them seem precocious. Home-educated children tend not to behave in childish ways because they are used to behaving and being treated like civilized human beings. Peer socialization amongst home-educated children tends to be in mixed age groups. You'll rarely find a group of 26-year-olds all together. This means that children learn to interact with others both older and younger than themselves as a matter of course. Most home education groups have wide age bands, say 0 to 11. Those with narrower remits, say 5 to 8-year-olds, would always have some younger and older siblings around. So a lot of socialization happens around activities and lessons. Your 7-year-olds in drama and the toddlers and teens are socializing while the class is going on. The kind of strict age and year segregation that you find in schools, and I have had children in school, so I'm not kind of making this up, but you're in year 2, I don't play with babies because I'm in year 3. That's just unheard of in home ed circles. It's really interesting to watch children playing up to socialise with older children and down to help littlies. It builds character and empathy, and it's a much more natural way of socialising. In times past, this would have been the norm, because families would have been much larger and children would have been used to living and socialising in mixed age groups, although it's a bit of a novelty in our day. Depending on where you live, there'll be a selection of home education groups to go to. These will range from academic groups, where children of similar ages and stages work on a project under the guidance of a tutor or parent volunteer, while siblings play or socialise in another room or outside. There are drama groups, sports groups, woodland and nature reserve groups, arts and craft groups, and regular meetups simply for socialising. There are a few Catholic home education groups that meet across the country, 2 email lists, and a Facebook group connecting Catholic home educators in the UK. If you live in London or any large urban area, you'll find more groups than there are days of the week. You'll have to choose carefully. Home education groups are not government funded. They are not government organised, they are not government planned. Parents organise things that they want to happen. Some take over long-running groups when the people running those groups move on because their children have grown up. Others start things up themselves because they think if they and their children want it, somebody else will too. Information about what's on is spread through email lists and Facebook. Home education groups tend to run on a shoestring. It's not expensive. There's usually a per-family fee to cover a hall rental and materials, and in my time these fees have ranged from £1 to £5 per family. People don't make a profit running home ed groups. These groups are important for children, but also for parents, and I can't overemphasise the importance of creating a good network of supportive friends if you're thinking about home educating. It will make all the difference in your life. You can divide families who home educate into 2 separate groups. There's those who've chosen to home educate for positive reasons. By this I mean they're motivated by the things about home education which they think makes it an optimum way for their children to learn and for their family to live. The second group are those who choose home education for negative reasons, because they've had bad experiences at school and they've withdrawn their children believing home education to be a less bad and sometimes their only option. Bullying, school phobia, lack of support for special needs, graphic sex education are common reasons given. For Catholic families, the lack of a properly Catholic school environment is another commonly cited reason. Looking at school and benefits and drawbacks of children is a whole presentation in itself. It's an area really worth exploring. But today I'm briefly going to look at reasons that parents might choose not to send their children to school, and in particular, given the context of the conference, I'm going to look at Catholic schools. Lapsation rate. Lapsation rate. Daphne MacLeod is quoted in the Catholic Herald, and she cites a 90% lapsation rate for children leaving Catholic school at 18. That's higher than Catholic children who go to non-Catholic schools. I mean, it's just an abysmal failure. I questioned this and I went and looked at various other sources, and I found 90 to 96% lapsation rates. The lowest I found anywhere is 80%. In all cases, this is higher than it would be otherwise. They're generally calculated by looking at the percentage of young people actively practicing the faith at age 18. I think it would be interesting to follow these through to age 30. So there's a double danger. Parents send their children to Catholic schools believing quite reasonably that their children will receive at least the bare minimum of decent catechesis, and that they'll be in an environment that supports the teaching magisterium of the Church. And to be fair, in some schools a brave effort is made. There are some heroic teachers working in our Catholic schools against the odds. Often they're working against the culture of the school itself to bring a modicum of authentic Catholicity to the lives of their students. However, many faithful Orthodox Catholic teachers find it easier, and just think about this, they find it easier and less compromising to work within the secular state system. Why? Because many state-funded Catholic schools, and I suspect private ones as well, do not adhere to the teachings of the Catholic Church. And for those faithful Catholic teachers, their conscience cannot permit them to teach ideas and ideologies at odds with the faith in the context of a Catholic school. There's the twin monster of sex education and British values, 2010 Equalities Act. And increasingly, for many families, government mandates on pro-gay, anti-marriage, pro-abortion and anti-family propaganda are becoming one of the main reasons to avoid school. Catholic schools aren't exempt. I think several people here are aware of the case of Bonus Pastor in South London, where really graphically explicit sex ed films were shown to children. Parents complained, perfectly reasonably, and nothing was done. So the parents complained more vociferously, leafleted outside the school to make sure the other parents knew what was going on, set up support networks and a website, and they did get a reaction from the school. The school phoned the police. The school phoned the police. People say to me, it's still legal to withdraw your child from sex education. So what's the problem? That doesn't solve the problem of a classroom environment made toxic. Don't forget that once you've seen something, you cannot unsee it. And once you've heard something, you can't unhear it. And this is the terrible danger that sex education in our schools poses to our children's sanctity. There's no way to reinstate lost innocence. We can only do damage control. So if you have a child in school, it is imperative that you're on damage control duty at all times. Your parental antennae need to be tuned into picking up whatever has been imparted in the classroom. Essentially, you will need to provide spiritual first aid to counter the effects of what they've seen or heard. You'll need to explain whatever it is that they've been taught within the context of Catholic teaching. You will need to reinforce their understanding of the faith, and you'll need to go back to this topic again and again to consolidate the remedy. And you'll need to be vigilant like this every single day that your child is in school. And people say to me, isn't it really hard home educating? Maybe I sound paranoid. Possibly. But we know that there is a concerted push to undermine the family and push a homosexual gender theory agenda in schools and in wider society. The difference is, in schools, children are a captive audience, and students often have to give answers and regurgitate information that might be completely at odds with their moral and religious beliefs. So you've got a 6-year-old who encounters gender theory propaganda at school. Actually, my now 9-year-old, when she was 6, encountered gender theory propaganda, even though she's home educated. She was playing at a friend's house, and this family had a cleaner, and my friend and her little friend, my daughter and her little friend were playing, and the cleaner said, "Do you know you two can get married? Girls can marry girls now." So my daughter came home and said, "Mummy, so-and-so's cleaner said that girls can get married." So we had a discussion about it, and I asked her what she thought marriage was all about, and she came to the conclusion of her own accord that actually it was a really stupid idea, and obviously girls can't marry girls, and we just left it there, and it's never had to come back again. So it does happen no matter where your children are, but there's a difference. Your 6-year-old at school encounters gender propaganda. They can be talked around it by a parent as well. Don't be silly, boys can't marry boys. But what if that propaganda continues year on year? With different teachers repeating it, different books in the classroom repeating it, events and plays that come to the school repeating it. Drip, 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 drip. It's erosion. Mummy and Daddy might be the only people left who seem to think this isn't right. The world, my parents. And that's the beginning of the erosion of parental authority. It's likely, in fact it's a sad fact, a devastating indictment on our culture, that all of our children, every child belonging to anyone in this room, will be exposed willingly or unwillingly to pornography. But we can't accept this with a shrug of the shoulders. Oh, that's the world now, we all have to live in it. That's capitulating, giving in. Catholic parents, Christian parents must never give in. We've been given the honour of guiding, raising and protecting our children. Their souls are our responsibility. Home educating is one way to protect them until they have a maturity that will allow them to better deal with, to process, to assess the frankly horrible things that our culture will inevitably throw at them. Home education allows time for the armour of faith to be strengthened before it is tested. That doesn't mean that all is lost for children at school. Far from it. For the sake of our society, parents who've got children at school, who are delegating some of their children's education to school, not all of it, they are still the first and primary educators. And it is of utmost importance that these parents fight to keep decency in the classroom, that they teach their children about custody of the eyes, that they train them in spiritual life-saving techniques. Home education isn't possible for everyone. It's not desirable for every family, and there's lots of good reasons that families send children to school. But what I am saying is that home education gives parents greater control, not total control by any means, but greater control over what their children encounter and when, and at the very least, it's a way of delaying the inevitable. And this is a good thing, particularly if the time in that delay is used to fortify and strengthen a child's faith. So if your child isn't in a state or independent school, what's the legal status of your education? Here in the UK, it's mandatory for every child to receive a full-time education at school or otherwise. And that is mandatory from the school year in which their 5th birthday falls. We're educating otherwise. The Education Act, 1996, states that the parent of every child of compulsory school age shall cause him to receive efficient full-time education suitable to his age, ability and aptitude, and to any special educational needs he may have, either by regular attendance at school or otherwise. We have an excellent system of law in this country. A person is innocent until proven guilty. Similarly, for now at least, parents providing an education are judged competent until proven otherwise. And the assumption is that they are providing a suitable education unless it is proven otherwise. In other words, the burden of proof is on the government, not on the parent, which is as it should be. By law, if your child has not been registered at a state school, you're under no obligation to tell the state if you decide to home educate. As things stand, there's absolutely no benefit to reporting yourself to the local authority. They've got no resources, no funding, and actually no knowledge about home education. Their remit is to monitor home educators for safeguarding purposes where those home educators are known. And if your local authority doesn't contact you, you don't need to contact them. But if they do contact you, it's sensible to meet them. While the law is on your side as a home educating parent, it's often more sensible to take the route of least resistance and agree to meet in a neutral place like a library. Show them some examples of your children's work. I found that home education officers are far more interested in photographs that show children out and about, socialising and enjoying life with other home educated children than they are at looking at pages of sums or spelling quizzes. There's lots of excellent advice online about how to meet with education officers if you ever get into that situation, and again, I'd be happy to talk to anyone who has questions afterwards. So the risks to home education now and in the future. We're fortunate in the UK to have a historic understanding of civil liberties that underpins the existing legislation about home education. But the political climate is becoming less positive towards the idea of the centrality of the family in the lives of children. The extremes of the political spectrum have always been hostile to the idea of home education. It was illegal in both Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany. Hitler has the distinction of being the first national leader to ban home education. This is because state education, that's education where the state mandates all aspects of the curriculum, is a potent social tool. Both the Nazis and the Soviets used state education to marginalise the family, create a rupture between parents and children, and thus effectively create a compliant workforce and army. Fortunately for us, we don't live in Nazi Germany or in Soviet Russia, or one of the satellite states. But the legacy of suspicion hovering over home education persists in many of those countries to this day. Home education was never made legal in Germany after the fall of the Third Reich, and to this day, parents will be sent to jail for refusing to send their children to state schools. The reason given is social cohesion. I'm sure many of you are aware of the home-educating Christian family who claimed political asylum in the US after the German government threatened to jail the parents and make the children wards of the state for the crime of home educating. I was at a home education meetup in Kent on Thursday, and I met two families who've just moved to Britain. Both were German, and they both moved simply because of home educating. I suspect we'll see more. Across the European continent, we see home education either illegal or so severely restricted as to be meaningless. For example, in many countries, children have to follow the exact same curriculum as schools. In some countries, they have to have it marked and examined by a local school on a weekly basis. Or take France, where there are annual inspections, including the parents' fitness to care for their own children, as well as severe academic restrictions. And if you think totalitarian ideas about education are in the past, you're mistaken. In December 1997, I was representing the BBC in Berlin at a conference about digital learning sponsored by the European Union. At a plenary question and answer session, I marvelled at the enormous contingent from 2 EU directorates involved in the conference. They were education directorates. They were all young, all the delegates were young, idealistic, and very ideologically driven. One rosy-cheeked young man stood, introduced himself, and declared that the European Union had a plan that guaranteed there would never be another war on European soil. He described with great pride how the project that he and his colleagues from the 18th Directorate General of the European Commission were working on was key to this goal. They were creating, he announced, a pan-European curriculum, eventually to be rolled out into all schools across the European Union. The jewel in the crown was the pan-European history curriculum, because, and wait for it, when all children in all European countries were taught the same history, there'd no longer be any motivation for war. So think about this for a sec. This is a project to create a common, unified and official history of Europe to be taught in all schools throughout Europe. When was the last time you heard that? Germany in the 1930s? Stalinist Russia? So we don't live in a totalitarian state. And in Britain, we have a legal tradition that accepts that parents are best placed to make decisions about their own children's education. Home educators don't cost the state a penny. And studies show that home educators do better academically across the board, regardless of social and economic background, than their schooled peers. So you think the government would love us. Looking across the channel, France has been tightening its already harsh restrictions on home educators in the name of avoiding radicalisation. Sound familiar? We've heard similar phrases bandied around here recently as well. And British home educators are watching France with increasing unease. We have a few things in our favour here, for the moment at least. The first is that home educating in the UK is not a predominantly religious phenomenon. And that's a good thing. It means that religion can't be pinpointed so easily as a reason to crack down on home education. Britain also has a legacy of civil liberties, from which stems a residual tolerance of home education in comparison with other European countries. The strong home education communities that have resulted mean that home-educated children have access to wide and varied social networks. And this is significant because proposed French legislation specifically mentioned the, and I'm quoting, voluntary desocialization destined to submit the child who is particularly vulnerable to a psychic, ideological, or religious conditioning. And that was given as the reason to crack down on out-of-school learning, very, very similar to the German legislation. Here, the current government is taking a laissez-faire attitude towards home education. If it's working, and the research shows it is, then why change it? And think of all the schools they'd have to build. But it's only a few years ago, and it's a few short years ago, that in his role as Secretary of State for Children's Schools and Families, Ed Balls did his best to crush home education. He commissioned a report on electively home-educated children, specifically trying to find reasons to tighten regulations. When the initial report recommended no changes to the existing situation, it was working, it wasn't broke, don't try fixing it. Balls commissioned a second report. That came up with the same answer. It's working, it's fine. So he decided to put a select committee onto it. We were saved by the bell, there was a general election, That was the end of the story for now. Backbencher Barry Shearman, who in that government was chairman of the Parliamentary Cross-Party Committee on Children, Schools and Families, asserted that faith education works all right as long as people are not that serious about their faith. But it gets worrying when you get more fundamentalist bishops, and I think he was referring to Bishop Egan, Mark Davies, at that time. He's also one that he made some comments years ago on a blog about Guy Fawkes Night, how it was wonderful to burn a Catholic on the bonfire. So, you know, we know his type. But Barry Shearman has been asking leading questions about home education for months on Twitter and making really cryptic comments. The message is clear. Home education is still in their sights and they will not be happy until it's gone. So there are future threats on the horizon. Statistically, only a very small minority of you will choose to home educate. Should all this stuff matter to the majority of parents who do not home educate? Absolutely. Home education is the litmus test of the relationship between the family and the state. Where the state accepts home education, the state is accepting the family as the natural and safe environment for a child to learn. By contrast, prohibition of home education is a symptom of the state's broader ideological position, suspicious of the family, wary of religious or ideological indoctrination, and insisting that professionals are better equipped than parents to guide children's academic and moral growth. Just think about the Scottish named person scheme for a recent example of a government distrusting parents to raise their own children. A government that does not respect the right of a family to determine their children's educational path will never respect the rights of the parents to be the primary influence on their children. So when the next round of state-led threats to home education kicks off, and trust me it will, pay attention, because it's not just about home education. Thank you. I'm not a teacher. I did cover earlier on in the talk. I talked about how some of the best and most successful home educators I've known have been people with quite limited education themselves, and that pedagogy isn't actually important because so much of what teachers do, and there are many teachers who home educate, and they've talked about how they've had to unlearn what they've learned at teacher training college, because it's been about teaching a group, it's about crowd management, it's about dealing with different abilities in a classroom. What you need to home educate your child, particularly when you're starting from the young, we're talking about 3 and 4 year olds here, is enthusiasm. You've got to love your child and go on a learning journey with them. And if that means, and for some parents that does mean brushing up on algebra, well, we're both learning then, aren't we? Are there any questions?
Not a question as such, but just not to steal your thunder, because you've done an amazing talk to explain about homeschooling. I'm homeschooling myself, along with other families here, and I hope some of our friends could come and join us, just to say a few words. Just talking from the heart, as a home educator, I'm not a teacher. Very daunting at the beginning. Just give you a little bit of a testimony of how we went through it. Before we had kids, you start to, I was born a cradle Catholic. You follow the ways, you do this, you go to church, only days of obligations, Sunday, don't miss Sunday Mass. But then when you become a parent yourself, then you've got so much more responsibility. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I think before we even had children, we started realizing, reading more, deepening our faith, reading more spiritual books. When we have children, our primary goal as parents, and for everyone as adults, as Catholics, is to get our children to heaven. That is our primary goal.
Could I just actually, a point I missed actually, which I think is the key, and I think you've actually hit it. Everyone in this room is going to have a personal judgment. We're all going to have to stand up and account for what we've done. And one of the main things as parents we're going to have to account for is, what did you do to fit your child for heaven? Before they left your care, what did you do? Where did you fail? And we all will have failed at some point. The flip side, the other side, is what will you have done to make the most of the gifts and talents your child has been given by God? And for us, and I suspect this is what you're saying as well. It's finding it's finding a balance. We have to use the gifts and talents that God has given the children. We have to fit them for heaven. And for many families, home educating is a good tool for that. It may not be the only way, but it makes things a bit easier.
It's not easy, but I tell you, as with any household family, be it at school or be it at homeschool, you gain many virtues coming together as a family. And I feel, on a personal note, it does bring the family together. I've got 3 boys, or blessed with 3 boys. I can say they're like any other kid, you know, they have their usual disagreements, and they really put me to the test, but you know, in the long run, I hope that they have a more closer bond, and just by meeting other homeschooling Catholic families, I can see the fruits that they bear in the children. So, yeah, in not so many words, to try and protect them as much as we can in terms of what we know is the right way according to the true teachings of the church. So to avoid that confusion in the very, very influential years, which is now, like the younger years, even at the teenage years is a very critical time as well. So homeschooling, you can take it as far as you want. And, you know, there's loads of resources out there. Like Antonia said, you don't have to have, you know, spending so much money on it. And, but yeah, we're still plodding along, and we still. The one thing is that we continue praying for each other, especially in the times that we're living in. And so, yeah, that's all I just wanted to share. I wanted to probably take it over to anyone else who wants to come up. Yeah.
Hello, good morning. For those of you who don't know, I think I know most of everybody in the room. My name's Crystal Clovis, married to the wonderful Daniel Clovis, son of the even more wonderful Greg and Aggie Clovis. I am a mother, nephew of the wonderful Joe Clovis. There's so many Clovises, I can't just keep going. I have 5 children myself, and I homeschool. My children are they range from the age of 8. I've got an 8-year-old, 6-year-old, 4-year-old, 2-year-old, and a 1-year-old. And I home educate for religious reasons, for educational reasons, and for family reasons. Religious reasons, by home educating my children, we are able to go to daily mass every morning as a whole family unit. Daniel and I are able to catechize our children. The children do not have undue influences from other children that are Catholic or non-Catholic, and we find that it works really well for us. In terms of educational reasons, I'd like to think that the work that we have put into the children so far has actually resulted in our children actually being ahead by a year to 2 years in most subjects. In terms of reading, my eldest daughter can read. She's 8 years old. She has a reading age of probably 13, 14, even older than that. And so in that respect, in terms of education, because you are able to give a lot of one-to-one tuition with the children, they grow to learn far better, far faster, and they enjoy it. In terms of family reasons, I think home education allows the family to flourish in a way that God has intended. We are together as a family unit. The children, I'd like to think, have a better relationship with God. They have a better relationship with us as parents, and they have a better relationship with their siblings because we see each other every day for the whole day, and I think that's key. Home education is not easy by any means of the imagination. As a mother, I have the children every day since day one, so I have no break. This 5 minutes up here is my break. And this probably won't be followed again for a long time.
Why do you think I agreed to speak today?
Yes. The reason actually I'm here is because I don't have the 3 younger children with me. They're with my parents. So this for me is a night out. But yes, home education is wonderful. I think if you can do it, if you have the means to do it, the time to do it, I think it's definitely something that you should consider. And the children really do enjoy it as well. I think it's not a case of we're shutting the children away from society. The children are, as Antonia was saying, the children are able to socialise, they can talk to people of their own age, they can talk to adults that are older than them. What I think you tend to find with most school children is that perhaps, I'm not saying generally speaking, but perhaps they're not able to talk to people that are, sort of adults. But anyway, homeschooling I think is great. So if you ever consider doing it.
And I think it's important to remember also that it doesn't have to be forever. It's any time, however many years. If you home educate your child for the first 3 years and send them on to the end of primary school, they're going to be better equipped to deal with whatever gets thrown at them. Educate them through primary school, they'll be better equipped whatever hits them in early secondary. Just because you decide to home educate your child at 4 doesn't mean that they're still going to be at home at 17 with you home educating them. Take it year on year and see what works best for your family. And for some families, it works wonderfully. So it's definitely worth giving a try. And it's like having Exhibit A and Exhibit B. It's fantastic.
We have Exhibit C as well. Angela, would you like to come?
If you've got time.
She obviously loves homeschooling too much that she can't.
And we also got Claudia in the audience, I think.
She's put her head down so that nobody can see.
Another one there too.
There's a few of us.
Yeah, there's a few.
Yes.
Right, are there any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you know people who were homeschooled up to maybe being professors or who've been out of universities?
Yeah, loads and loads. I mean, for most of the time I've been home educating, we've lived in South East London. We don't anymore. But during that time, I've seen a whole generation of children older than mine, and my eldest is doing GCSEs now, so they're kind of years above him, going on and going through to university and beyond, and out into work. So yes,
They do get jobs. The thing is,
they do become productive members of society. They get the same, they will get the same, if you want them to, they can have exactly the same GCSEs and A-levels as anyone else.
We did a similar thing, but ours was just 3 hours in a month. It was Catholic school, and then that, but we found the children did well in the universities, and they pursued their dream. Whereas in the schools, you find sometimes they are pushed to do subjects or other stuff that
schools have to have a rhythm, and everyone's got to keep up with it, and that's kind of what I was getting at when I was talking about how learning ebbs and flows. Something that's quite interesting is a few people have mentioned to me how people I know who are in teaching in sixth form, how home educated children, when they come in, cope with A-levels better than children who've gone through school for GCSEs. And the reason is they're really used to working independently. And for a lot of school children, there's a really big jump between the kind of learning you do and the kind of studying you do at GCSE and how you move on at A-level. So, it definitely has its benefits. Right. Thank you. Thank you very much.